The letter fell first. One moment it was tucked inside the spine of an old book, and the next it was on the floor, cream-colored, folded in thirds, edges soft from years of handling. Ava Bennett stared at it for 3 full seconds before she picked it up. She should have set it on the desk. She should have walked away. She did neither. She read it. The handwriting was careful at first, then urgent, like whoever wrote it had started composed and ended desperate. It spoke of watching someone move through a room and feeling the air change. It spoke of silence that felt like music. It spoke of a love so large and so terrifying that the only reasonable response had been to fold it into thirds, tuck it into a book, and never speak of it again. There was no name at the top, no signature at the bottom, just words that hit Ava somewhere behind her sternum and refused to leave. She read the last line twice. Then, without thinking, without meaning to, in a voice barely above a breath, she whispered it back to the page. "Love you too." Silence that followed was enormous, and then from the doorway of the library came a sound so small it almost wasn't there, the quiet shift of a shoe on marble. Ava turned. Dante Romano stood in the doorway. He was still in his dinner clothes, jacket gone, top button undone, a man who looked like he had been on his way somewhere else entirely and had simply stopped. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 3 years of working in his house. Not anger, not coldness, something far more dangerous than either. He had heard every word. Ava's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The letter trembled in her hands, and she became suddenly, acutely aware of how she must look, standing in his private library, holding his private letter, speaking words that were not hers to speak into the quiet of his home. Her face went hot. Her chest went tight. "Mr. Romano, I wasn't." The book fell and he held up one hand, just that. One hand raised slightly and the words dissolved in her throat. He looked at her for a long moment that stretched like pulled thread, thin and taut and on the edge of snapping. Then he lowered his hand, turned, and walked away without a single word. Ava stood in that library for a long time after he left. The letter was still in her hands. Her heartbeat was everywhere, in her throat, her fingertips, her ears. She set the letter on the shelf with exaggerated care, as if gentleness now could undo what had already been done, and walked out of the room on legs that barely felt like hers. She did not sleep that night. Neither, it seemed, did he. She knew, because at 2 in the morning she came downstairs for water and saw the light still burning under the study door. She stood in the hallway for just a moment, the marble cold under her bare feet, and then she turned and went back upstairs and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling until dawn came gray and quiet through the curtains. By morning she had built a plan. She would be invisible. She had been invisible before. 3 years of learning which hallways he used, which rooms he preferred, which silences meant leave and which meant stay. She would simply reverse everything she knew and become a ghost in the walls of the Romano mansion until the memory of last night faded into nothing. The plan lasted 40 minutes. Elena, the head housekeeper, found her in the east corridor and looked at her the way old women look at young ones who are walking toward something they don't yet understand. "Whatever happened last night," she said, without preamble and without warmth, "let it go. Men like him don't feel, they collect. There is a difference, and women who forget that difference don't last long in this house." Ava nodded. She said, "Yes, ma'am." She went back to work 3 corridors away, in a room full of men waiting for orders. Dante Romano stood at the window and said nothing. Marco, who had stood beside him for 15 years and had never once seen him distracted, watched his employer stare at the garden below with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve an equation he didn't have all the numbers for. "Sir," Marco said for the 3rd time. Dante turned from the window. "Clear the room." Marco cleared the room. When they were alone, Dante picked up the glass of water on his desk, set it down without drinking, and said, "Who authorized Reyes to move his men to the North Quarter?" Marco blinked. "We covered that 20 minutes ago. You approved it yourself." A pause. "Right." Marco said nothing. But he watched the door that Ava had passed through 10 minutes earlier, and he thought several things he was wise enough to keep to himself. By afternoon, the house had shifted in ways too subtle for most people to notice. Ava's workload was quietly redistributed. 3 of her assigned rooms in the East Wing, the oldest part of the house, the one with the crumbling balcony railing and the guard who leered, were reassigned without explanation to 2 of the other staff. When Ava asked Elena why, Elena looked at her for a moment and said she didn't know. She did know. She chose not to say. That evening, one of the guards, a broad man named Tia, who had made a habit of standing too close to Ava when she passed through the front hall, was dismissed from his post. No warning, no discussion. He was simply told to collect his things. He asked Marco why. Marco said only that his services were no longer required. Ava found out through the kitchen staff. She sat with the information for a long time, turning it over, looking for another explanation. She didn't find one. She was starting to understand that invisible was no longer an option. The note arrived the next morning. Small, folded once, delivered by Marco with the particular blankness of expression that meant he had opinions he was restraining. 2 words in handwriting she now recognized. My study, she went. Dante was standing at the window again, back to her, when she entered. The room smelled like old wood and leather and the faint ghost of whiskey. Ava stopped just inside the door and waited, and the silence between them was thick enough to press against her skin. You can sit, he said without turning. I'd rather stand. A pause, something that might on another man's face have been the beginning of a smile. He turned from the window and looked at her across the room, and the distance felt both enormous and insufficient. Say it again, he said. The air left the room. Ava felt her heart slam once hard against her ribs. Mr. Romano, I know what you read. His voice was even, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent decades deciding exactly how much of himself to allow into every sentence. I'm not asking about the letter, I'm asking you to say what you said. It was the last line, I wasn't thinking, I didn't mean, Ava, her name in his mouth, just that. She stopped talking. He looked at her with those unreadable dark eyes and said quietly, say it again. She couldn't. The word sat in the center of her chest like a stone, and she could not move it, and she could not speak around it, and she stood there in his study with her hands at her sides, feeling more exposed than she had ever felt in her life. She turned and walked out. He let her go. But that night, when she sat at the small desk in her room and took out a piece of paper and wrote the words, I respectfully resign my position effective immediately, her hand was shaking. She folded the letter, slipped it under his study door at midnight when the house was quiet, went back to her room, began slowly to pack. She had filled half a bag when the letter came back, torn, clean in half, slid under her door without a sound. Ava stared at the 2 pieces on her floor for a long moment. Then something that had been quiet in her for a very long time woke up, and it was not gentle. She picked up both halves, walked down the hall, and pushed open the study door without knocking. Dante was sitting behind his desk. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for. You can't do that, she said. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were not. I quit. You don't get to just, you're not leaving. You don't own me. The words landed between them, and the room went very still. Dante set down the pen he was holding with a care that suggested he was choosing every movement deliberately. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had looked at her that first night in the library, the look she hadn't been able to name, and when he spoke his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. No, he said, but I'd like to. If you are watching this, and your heart is pounding right now, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Hit that like button and keep watching, because this story is just getting started. Ava left the study. She did not go back to her room to pack. She went to the garden instead, because the garden was the one place in the Romano mansion that had always felt like hers. She had replanted it in her first month, dug out the dead things, brought in roses and jasmine, spent her free mornings on her knees in the soil while the rest of the house was still waking up. It was the one space where she knew exactly who she was. She was sitting on the stone bench between the rose beds when Marco found her. He sat down beside her without being invited, which was very unlike him, and for a moment they both just looked at the garden. 15 years, Marco said. I have worked for that man for 15 years. In that time I have watched him build an empire. I have watched him walk away from things most men would die for without blinking. I have never not once seen him chase anything. He paused. He acquires, he commands, he decides, he does not chase. Ava said nothing. He tore that letter himself, Marco said. I want you to know that, not a staff member, not me, his hands. She looked at the roses for a long time. That doesn't change what he is, Marco agreed. It doesn't, but it changes what he's becoming. He left her there with the jasmine and the evening light and a feeling in her chest she didn't have a name for yet. The threat came 3 days later. It came the way all dangerous things came in the Romano world, suddenly and without warning and all at once. Ava was in the kitchen when the sound of raised voices and rapid footsteps broke through the usual quiet of the house. She stepped into the hallway and was almost immediately caught by the arm, not roughly, but with a grip that brooked no argument, and she looked up into Dante's face. He was already in motion, already pulling her back down the corridor, already scanning every door and window with the focused precision of a man who had spent his life calculating threats. His jaw was set. His eyes were everywhere. Where are we? Don't talk, he said, not unkindly, just urgent. He moved her through 2 corridors and down a short flight of stairs to a heavy door she had never noticed before, opened it with a key from his inside pocket, and brought her into a small room, stone walls, a chair, a lamp, a lock on the inside. Safe, quiet, sealed. He turned to her. His hands came up to her shoulders carefully, like she was something he was afraid of breaking, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath stop. "Open this door," he said, "for anyone." "Only me, Dante." It was the first time she had used his name. They both heard it. Something moved across his face, swift and unguarded, there and gone. "Only me," he said again. And then he was gone and the door was locked, and Ava sat down on the floor because her legs decided they had done enough. She sat there for what felt like hours. She listened to the distant sounds of the house, voices, movement. Once a sound she didn't let herself identify. She thought about the letter. She thought about his handwriting going from careful to desperate. She thought about roses and resignation letters torn in half. She thought about a man who had spent 15 years acquiring everything he wanted and had apparently, inexplicably, decided that the one thing he wanted most was something he was afraid to reach for. The door opened. Dante stepped in. He looked like a man who had just walked through a storm and come out the other side, composed on the surface, something rowered just beneath. He looked at her sitting on the floor, and something in his face softened in a way she hadn't known it could. He sat down beside her, on the floor. Dante Romano, in his dark suit with his empire running overhead, sat on the cold stone floor beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. And the fact that it wasn't, the fact that this was extraordinary, that Marco would probably require a moment to recover if he ever found out, made Ava's chest ache with something she couldn't contain much longer. The quiet between them was different now. Not the cold silence of the first night, not the taut silence of the study. Something warmer, something that had been waiting. "Why did you keep it?" she asked. Her voice was soft. "The letter, all those years." He didn't answer right away. He looked at the wall across from them, and she watched the careful architecture of his composure hold and then quietly begin to yield. "Because some things are true," he said, "even when you're too afraid to send them." She turned to look at him. "Who was it for?" The silence this time was the longest yet, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Long enough that she started to build a wall back up inside herself, a reasonable, sensible wall, the kind that kept maids from falling in love with mafia bosses and kept worlds that had no business touching from colliding. Then he said, "The night you stayed late to repot the garden roses. You were singing. I don't remember the song." Ava's breath left her body. "I sat at that window for 2 hours," he said, and his voice was low and careful and honest in a way she had never heard from him before, "watching you with your hands in the dirt, singing to flowers, completely unaware that the man who owned the house was watching you and understanding, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to want something he didn't know how to take." She could not speak. There were no words in her that were adequate to this moment. "I wrote it that night," he said. "And I knew before I finished the first line that I would never send it. Because you were good and this life is not. Because you sang to roses and I moved bodies. Because some distances," he said quietly, "feel too wide to cross." Ava looked at him for a long moment. This man who had torn up her resignation with his own hands, who had moved her away from danger without explanation, who had fired a guard for standing too close and sat on a cold stone floor because she was on it. This man who had written love letters to a woman he thought he couldn't have and hidden them in books and left them there for years. "You should have sent it," she said. He looked at her. "I would have written back," she said. Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically. Dante Romano was not a dramatic man, just quietly, just completely. The way a window breaks in winter, the cold finally finding the one thin place. "You don't have to say it again," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges now, honest in a way that cost him something. "I heard you the first time." Ava reached over and took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands the way a man looks at something he has wanted so long that having it feels like a dream he's afraid to move in. Then his fingers closed around hers, slowly, deliberately, like a decision, and he held on. They stayed like that in the quiet room while the house settled around them, while the danger passed and the night deepened, and the garden waited above them with its roses and its jasmine, patient as it had always been. Later, when the house was still and the study lamp was the only light left burning, the letter lay open on Dante's desk. Beside it, a single rose from the garden, placed there by hands that were no longer afraid. They said he was cold. They said he was untouchable. They said men like him didn't love, they only took. only commanded, only collected. But no one tells you what happens when a cold man finally finds the one thing that warms him. He holds on, quietly, completely, without apology, forever. If this story moved you the way it moved us creating it, please subscribe to this channel. We have so many more stories like this waiting for you. Leave a comment below telling us whose side you were on. Were you rooting for Ava from the start, or did Dante win you over slowly? And if you want to see what happens next between these two, like this video so we know to continue their story. We read every single comment, and your support is what keeps these stories alive.